Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the LEA Special Education Point of Contact monthly webinar. My name is Tiffany Ingram, and we will be starting our webinar shortly. We'll give everybody probably about one more minute to join. I see that there are some folks that are still logging in and connecting to sound. For those who are already here with us, please be mindful that we have a copy of our presentation today in our handout section. In the tab within the GoToWebinar taskbar, you'll be able to download that PDF document, which will have links to many of the things that we are discussing today will be there for you to click. And this will also, of course, be recorded and uploaded to our website, hopefully by the end of this week. For those folks who may join late, we will have this recording available online as well. And again, for those folks who are just now joining us, welcome to the LEA Special Education Point of Contact monthly webinar. We will be getting started as we have a full presentation here for you this month. Of course, as we are going through our presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to drop that in your chat box, and we will do our best to answer as we go through the presentation. In addition, we are going to hold for 10 minutes after our presentation is concluded to answer any questions that you may have. We want to give everyone an opportunity to get their questions answered. We're going to go ahead and get started. And again, this is our September LEA Special Education Point of Contact webinar. Our agenda for today, we have a packed agenda as I shared previously, and we'll be going through our policy reminders and updates, our IDA monitoring updates. We'll also be talking about preparing for child count because that season is upon us. There are some SEDS updates we would like to share, as well as transportation updates. Our non-public team will be joining us to provide updates for our LEAs, as well as we'll close out to talk about our special education continuous learning community of practice, as well as some additional announcements and reminders about other trainings that will be provided through OSSE. I know that some of you may be new to your role here, and this may be your first webinar, but we do want to kind of just summarize the role of the LEA Special Education Point of Contact. And 4 big buckets, we have our policy and guidance, our evidence-based practices, monitoring and compliance, and data apps and systems. And many of you who work collaboratively with folks around assessments or pre-K, special education, POC, whether you have an early childhood transition coordinator, LEA transportation POC, your LEA data manager will be critical in the role that you have as the LEA SPED POC, and then also the ELA English Language Learner Coordinator. These are all folks that we expect that you would be collaborating with within your LEA to support our students. Lastly, we always want to provide contact information so that you can know who here at OSSE will be able to support you in all the many areas that you may have questions around. Again, this presentation is in the handout section of the GoToWebinar tab for you to use this as a resource to have the contact information for many points of contact here at OSSE who will support you in your role as the LEA SPED POC. I would now like to turn this over to Christy Weaver-Harris to provide us with some of the policy reminders and updates.
Good morning, everyone. This is Christy Weaver-Harris, the Policy Manager in OSSE's Division of K-12 Systems and Supports. I have just a couple of very quick reminders. Reminder that OSSE has issued a variety of guidance around LEA obligations related to COVID-19. On July 21st, we issued a consolidated guidance for remote and blended learning. And this document should be especially helpful if you are in a remote posture. It consolidates our existing guidance around IDA Part B and non-public school procedures. It has some additional information on parent training and counseling to be provided as a related service. It explains the distinction between homebound instruction and optional distance learning, and has some additional information on serving students who are medically fragile. So I encourage you to refer to this guidance as you are embarking on the start of the school year. And also please make sure that you're referring frequently to OSSE's COVID landing page, where we will continue to post all of our guidance and additional information there. Next slide, please. Additionally, on July 28th, OSSE provided LEAs with notice that we had issued the Early Childhood Transition Frequently Asked Questions document. Now, this document was born out of a working group effort that some of you have participated in, and we very much appreciate your participation and your assistance in developing this document. This document seeks to clarify LEA responsibilities related to students who are transitioning from Part C, Early Intervention Services, to Part B, Preschool Special Education Services. And as you know, the focus of this is related to the DL litigation. So this guidance addresses charter LEA responsibilities to participate in transition conferences for all students who are Stage 4 or Stage 5 enrolled in their LEA. It explains that the transition conference invitation constitutes referral for the purposes of the initial evaluation timeline. And it also has some information on LEA's responsibilities to conduct reasonable efforts to obtain consent for evaluation. I again encourage you to refer to this document as you are starting the school year, especially as you are enrolling students who are transitioning from Part C services or who have previously transitioned from Part C through early stages. Next slide, please. And to that end, we would like to remind you that LEAs are responsible for documenting the first provision of specialized instruction for students who are transitioning from Part C. So the student groups that this applies to include students who are at or around the age of 3 who are transitioning directly from Part C, Early Intervention Services, students who are at or around the age of 4 who are transitioning from an extended IFSP, which is again provided by Strong Start Early Intervention, but they are transitioning under an extended IFSP a year later, and students ages 3 through 5 who are newly determined eligible for special education, including children who are transferring from out of state. So if you have a student who is between the age of 3 and 5 who enrolls in your LEA and who has not had documentation of specialized instruction having been previously provided by an LEA, you do need to be documenting just the first provision of that service. So you're not required to document specialized instruction on an ongoing basis. This is only for the first provision. You're also not required to document it after the student's IEP has been revised or amended if you had previously provided special education under the prior IEP, or specialized instruction, I'm sorry, under the prior IEP. You are also not required to document this for children who are under the age of 6, who are continuing within your LEA with a current eligibility determination and who previously received specialized instruction. So those students are students who are matriculating within your LEA. So they were in kindergarten last year, you documented specialized instruction provision last year, and they are continuing within your LEA. You also do not have to document specialized instruction for students who are under the age of 6 who are transferring in from another LEA and who had previously received specialized instruction. I do see a question that has popped up around documenting provision of specialized instruction for students who have speech-only IEPs. In that instance, you are not required to document the first provision of speech in any different way than is already documented as a related service. So when OSSE goes in to pull the monitoring for this, we look at for students who have specialized instruction and related services, we look for the documentation of the first provision of specialized instruction. But if the student is on a speech-only IEP, we will look at the related services documentation for that student. So you do not have to double document it. And again, we have some resources on our website related to this. There's a Dear Colleague letter related to obligations around the DLV DC lawsuit in general, and a second Dear Colleague letter around specifically specialized instruction tracking for this group of students. There's also some training materials on our website, and you can always feel free to reach out to me directly if you ever have any questions about these obligations. Next slide. We're going to turn things over to the IDEA monitoring team to provide you with some updates.
Good morning, everybody. This is Karen Morgan Donaldson from the IDEA monitoring team. I just wanted to give you a quick update about our IDEA Part B determinations. Determinations for federal fiscal year 2018 will be issued later this month. Just as a quick overview of the LEA determinations process, OSSE conducts various monitoring activities throughout the year and collects a variety of data from LEAs. The determinations process compiles the data from those monitoring activities and data collection, and it puts it into elements or criteria used to calculate determination scores. Each element is worth a predetermined number of points. Each LEA's level of compliance and or performance for each element is weighted, and as a result, each LEA's ability or failure to meet the requirements for each element, a determination level is assigned based on an overall score. So basically, your LEA's determination that you will be receiving shortly, think of it as your LEA's report card for IDEA Part B. There will be a webinar outlining the determinations process. This is the second year that we are using a QuickBase application to roll out these determinations. So please join us for a webinar on September 22nd. And there is a link on this slide where you can register for that. Thank you. Next slide.
Thanks so much, Karen. We're going to turn things over to Rita so she can share all about preparing for the 2020-21 school year in child count.
Awesome, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rita Larkins from the Office of CIO at OSSE, and I will be going through the child count and helping you to prepare for child count for the 2021 school year. Next slide. So as you all are aware, for our new folks that are on the line today, I'm going to walk through just our kind of brief agenda for this child count training. I'm going to cover an overview of the process as well as that timeline and ways that you can prepare in advance by resolving errors, completing necessary IEP amendments, and then using some of the data applications and troubleshooting that we have in place to help you with this process. So I'm going to go now into the overview of the child count process. And for our new SPED POCs, next slide. For our new SPED POCs that we have on the line, just so that you understand that this is a federally mandated activity. We do this annually. And this really serves as the official special ed enrollment number for the District of Columbia. So it is very important that we make sure that student information is correct, and you'll see that in the next few slides. So what we rely on to certify this is accurate, reliability of the data that's being submitted. How you can help in this process, next slide. The accuracy of the data impacts your funding for special education. And so that's really one of the most important parts about this, in addition to making sure that you're reviewing that data and that it is provided, or that data that's provided via SEDS, our special education data system, is accurate. So if any of the students' special information, special education information is inaccurate in the system, that data has to be corrected in the source system. And everyone knows the source system for our special ed data is SEDS. What that means your student populations that are enrolled as of October 5th, 2020 of this year, that is who this will include. So the student must also have, not only be enrolled, but also have a current IEP or current eligibility. IEP amendments that are going to be related to child count, you need to have those completed by November 12th in time for the certification. So if you have an amendment that needs to get done, you need to allow enough time, whether you're going to have a meeting with the parent or just do an amendment, you need to make sure that you are allowing enough time prior to the certification on November 13th. Next slide. So we talked about some of the student populations that get included in child count, and this just gives you a quick overview of which students that includes. So when you look at the columns, it talks about the IEP eligibility, whether the student is receiving services and whether those students are included in child count. So it's important that the student have a current IEP and eligibility to be included. And you can refer back to this chart just so that you're clear with what that student status should be to be included in child count. Next slide. So our timeline this year, very similar to last year as it aligns with our enrollment audit and some of the other data activities that happen at OSSE. So today, this is the child count training webinar. So today serves as that training for your child count training. From the time frame of September 18th through November 10th, the LEA POC, you good folks on the phone today, should be assessing and reviewing student errors and any data anomalies that you are finding. Now, you don't have to find that on your own. We have a data application that helps you to locate and resolve those errors, and I'll talk about that just a little bit later. On October 9th, the head of school is going to do a certification of the unaudited enrollment and anomalies acknowledgement form. So that will also be comprised of data errors. On November 13th, the head of school will then do the final demographic data certification, the child count certification. And then on November 16th, that final audited enrollment or enrollment audit numbers get certified by the head of school. So that is the timeline for this year, for this year's child count. Next slide. So some other reminders that we were talking about for child count this year, and the most important thing is data accuracy. So you need to be reviewing and updating the data in those respective source systems. So for our special ed data, of course, that is going to be SEDS. For demographic information, of course, you'll work with your data manager to update any of that information in the school SIS. For issue resolution, LEAs need to submit OST tickets, and you need to submit them before the deadline to ensure that the resolution can happen before the certification date. So in all cases where there is a data discrepancy, the LEA must resolve that discrepancy prior to the child being included in the child count. Next slide. Here are some ways that you are able to get prepared in advance, starting now, for child count. So you can go through the process, and we talked about this at the beginning and the end of the school year, of removing all students from your SEDS roster who no longer attend your LEA. So we're talking about students that have aged out, or students that have withdrawn and are still appearing in SEDS. You need to go through the proper steps to make sure that you are exiting those students. You need to ensure the SEDS records are fully transferred for all students with disabilities enrolled at your LEA. So if you have a student that is at your LEA and you have not yet received their records in SEDS, you need to ensure that those records are transferred. and you can do that through the OST. Need to train, excuse me, case managers on how to spot common errors on the IEP. Then you should also be checking the Unified Data Errors report daily so that you are aware of any errors that we are flagging in the system for the purposes of child count. And then finally, you'll update all IEPs that are set to expire this fall. So you want to make sure that that IEP is still active for child count purposes. Next slide. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the common data errors and anomalies, and then some resolutions that you can implement to correct those for the purposes of child count. Next slide. Now, before we actually talk about those errors, let's just talk quickly about pulling reports and SEDS. One of the things I want to remind you of is when you're searching for students with disabilities and you're using the filter special ed, you may not capture some students who have expired IEPs or if the records are not fully transferred. So be sure that you're not using those filters when you're searching for those students. So as a summary of some of those child count actions that we talked about, for any kind of demographic data type or data error, name, date of birth, race, ethnicity, you want to make sure that that is updated in your student information system, whether that be eSchool Plus or PowerSchool, whatever your LEA is using. For special ed data errors, which could include disability, maybe the child's age changed and they still have developmental delay, the IEP end date, you want to review that IEP date. If it's accurate, then of course no action is required, but it may require that you make an update in SEDS. You want to review the educational environment. You want to make sure that that is accurate or you don't have any missing information. If so, that again, that's something that you would update in SEDS. And then in the section for dedicated aids, you want to make sure that that information is correct. If the system is saying that the student has a dedicated aid, they should also have a plan for that aid in the system. And you can review that information for the student in SEDS. Next slide. So when you are reviewing your child count data anomalies, you'll be using the Unified Data Errors Click application. And hopefully at this juncture, everyone has gone through the necessary training as a SPED POC so that you can get access to the Click application. And this is going to contain all of the special ed errors and suggested resolution paths. They will be provided for you within that Click application. So all special ed POCs should really have access, you should already have access to that Click application. Next slide. So some of the common data errors, educational environment, that's being pulled from the most recent IEP and SEDS. So of course, if that information is not accurate, you can use the Update IEP tab to make those changes. So previously, I believe last year we were using, going through the amendment process. Now we are using this Update IEP tab, and you can make educational environment changes on that page. Next slide. The special education levels. So if this information is incorrect, if you have a UDE for special education levels, you'll be able to go in and confirm the start and end dates of services on the student's IEP. And then you can also confirm the least restrictive environment percentage, and the check boxes are appropriately marked. So that's information you'll be able to, again, go into the student's record in SEDS and make necessary corrections if that is needed. Next slide. So now we're talking about in the next sets of errors, we're talking about students that have expired IEPs, but the eligibility is still active. So what that requires is that the LEA will hold an IEP meeting to update and finalize that student's IEP in SEDS. So again, the student must have an active eligibility or IEP to be included in child count. Next slide. Another common error that we see is that the student is still active in SEDS, but withdrawn in your student information system. So this is where I talked about in the beginning that the LEA should go through the process of withdrawing that student with the appropriate exit codes, making sure the appropriate exit codes were used. And if there are additional steps required, such as a PWN or graduation document, student age out, whatever those scenarios can be, to make sure that we're following the appropriate process in our student information system to exit the student and also to administratively exit that student from the LEA SEDS roster. What you will see is our entry exit guidance, and that tells you just a little more information about removing students from your SEDS roster, removing special ed students from the roster. Next slide. And I think I touched on this just a little bit. If the student turned age 6 and the educational environment designated on the IEP is no longer appropriate for the child's age, OSSE accounts for those students turning age 6 5 days prior to the November 13th certification. So those students are excluded from the error pools based on that date of birth. Next slide. The student has specialized instruction or missing services finalized on the IEP. Now, we see this a lot where the services are actually on there, but they have not been updated to include the current year. So sometimes that just requires us to go and do an amendment to make sure that we're finalizing it with the correct service hours are accurately reflected, and also the end dates for those services are included on that student's IEP. So that's really the data that's being pulled to determine if those are active services on that IEP. So if any of that needs to be corrected, you need to make corrections. You'll go in and complete and finalize an amendment or hold an annual IEP meeting to review and update the student's eligibility or service hours. Next slide. If the student turned 8 years old and is eligible under the developmental delay category, then the LEA needs to conduct a reevaluation to determine the appropriate disability category. And then, of course, you're going to need to update and finalize the IEP for that student. So if the student's date of birth is inaccurate, that's another area. If you may be flagged for this, the child turned 8, but you may find that the date of birth may be incorrect. So in that case, you would correct it in the LEA student information system. Again, this is where the collaboration of your registrar and your data manager come together so that you can make these corrections. Next slide. The educational environment is not appropriate based on the student's age. Again, this is another area where you're going to go and review the student's date of birth to ensure that the age is accurate. So if the age is not accurate, we're going to do an update in the student information sys. If the age displayed is accurate, then the LEA is going to need to select the appropriate educational environment in SEDS, and then you are able to do that through your IEP update. It is not necessary for you to do an amendment. You can use the IEP update. Next slide. We have just laid out some of the educational environment definitions. These are often questions that we receive. What does level 1 through 4 mean in terms of service hours? So we've kind of laid that out for you. You'll all receive a copy of this, so you can definitely go back and review that information. Next slide. So IEP amendments for child count purposes, we've just kind of outlined 3 of those common areas. Now I know that we used to do the educational environment for an amendment. Now I just want to make sure you know that you can address that with the IEP update tab. Another common area for amendments are settings, frequencies, and the length of services. and also the missing dedicated aid information. So those are the three most common areas where people need to do changes to the IEP, either update IEP tab or through the IEP amendment process. Next slide. So for amendments, if you're doing an IEP amendment for child count purposes, you know that you can set up your meeting, or you can set up those changes to be held without holding a meeting, as long as you have the documented written agreement with the parent. So you can go ahead and amend your IEP without having the meeting, as long as that is documented between the parent and the LEA. Next slide. Okay, so now that we have seen all of the different errors, I know that we have several new SPED POCs. I want to make sure that you know where to find that list of errors, and that is your Unified Data Errors Click application for child count. And if you can, next slide. So within Click, there are several applications that the SPED POCs have available to them, but specifically to this conversation, you will be able to see the Related Services Management Report, the RSMR, and you'll also see the Unified Data Errors. So if you are an LEA POC and you do not yet have access to these Click applications, please contact your OSSE data liaison. They can assist you with getting connected to these applications. As a starting point, you want to make sure, check with your data manager, you want to make sure that you are listed as the SPED POC in eSchool Plus, as that is what controls access to these applications. Next slide. All right, so just a quick summary of what we've talked about in terms of preparation for child count. You're going to make sure that all the students listed were enrolled as of October 5th. You'll work with your data manager and enrollment staff to make sure that that student information, demographic information is correct in your SIS. You'll view those UDEs in Click on a daily basis to make sure that any updates that need to be made are happening. And then will ensure the IEPs are accurate and up to date for educational environment, services, dedicated aid, and the disability category. And of course, you'll amend any IEPs as necessary to rectify errors and data anomalies. Finally, if you have an issue or if anything arises in abnormality or an error, you want to submit your questions in the OSSE OST. And then resolve all of these errors or data anomalies no later than November 10th to be considered timely for child count purposes. Last slide. All right. As I wrap up, I just want to alert you to just a few special updates in SEDS. You will now see, once you log into SEDS, the independent student drop-off form in English and in Spanish. You'll see that in the document section when you log into SEDS. So that's a new update that you'll see for that form in English and in Spanish. And I think that is a great segue into the next section, which I believe is about transportation. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Rita. Turn it over to the transportation team, Doug and Wesley.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Douglas Johnson of OSSE DOT's Data Technology Team. We are responsible for administrating the TOPE system that enables you to submit transportation requests for your students that are eligible for transportation. So we can go to the next slide. All right, hold on. So for this school year, some decisions that as a coordinator that you have to make when it comes to your students needing transportation. So in preparation of that is some student level items that need to be addressed. So those student level assignments are: how will students be assigned to a particular schedule, and which students will be in school on which days. So we know that due to COVID, Many of our schools are creating cohorts, so we would need to know that also when it comes to transportation this year, so we can know what days of the week to pick up and drop off the students to school. Prioritizing service preparations and data submissions for students with disabilities. Submit the required school calendars and transportation request forms. If you all are planning to have in-school or hybrid sessions coming soon, we would definitely need your calendars in the systems as soon as possible, and also your student transportation requests as well, so we can route them properly and they can have transportation at the beginning of the school year. Schools schedules to include the first day of school of in-person services. So we know that many schools may have already begun their distance learning, which is, for example, could be August 31st. But your in-service person service date could be for September the 8th, as we see here in this example. So we will have to have those students' transportation requests in. We're requesting that they're in 30 days prior to that in-person start date. If the consideration and decisions are delayed into transportation preparation at this time, LEA should consider and prepare to utilize the parent or LEA reimbursement options. So that means that if there's an issue or some type of data transfer issue when it comes to the student trying to get transportation, the LEA can assume the responsibility of transporting the students, and if there any bill that occurs, OSSE DOT will reimburse them or the parent if they decide to do that. If your LEA is not offering in-person services for students with disabilities, currently there's no action required, but we still want you to input your calendars into the system of TOTE. Next slide, please. Transportation guidance for SY 2021. There are some key operational processes for LEAs to make note of in order for DOT to appropriately complete start of school preparations and to deliver timely services for start of the new school year. So some things that LEAs need to do on their end. This is some things that OSSE needs to handle on our end in order for students to get to school on their first day of class. So these deadlines here are sample dates, but what we'll need for the LEA to do is submit school calendars in TOTE. And if you need assistance, we're always here to assist you with that. Submit student transportation request forms. So that means reach out to the parent to confirm the addresses, the contact information, so we can have the correct addresses when it comes to routing the students. And on our end, we'll do a data verification as well, because after you submit a transportation request, sometimes the parent can have a new address or something like that. So we do a data verification and we configure the system, data transfers, routing, Q&A process, and routes assignments and things of that nature. So that's the stuff that we will do on our end between that time period as well. So the dates in the table above are based on the start dates of school being August the 24th and August the 31st. LEA's data submission should be no less than 30 days prior to their first day of school. So we encourage you, if you're making a decision sometime soon of having a hybrid schedule in person for your students with special needs, please make sure you have that information in the system 30 business days prior to that first day of school. Schools that will conduct in person, that's basically relating to schools that will conduct in-person training. DOT will conduct outreaches to LEA and parent based on their start date. So once we get that information, our outreach team will continue to reach out to the parents just to confirm the information that was inputted by the school. Next slide, please. Recently, OSSE DOT, we sent out a bus safety kit documentation. If you didn't receive it, we'll send it out to you again if you didn't receive it the first time. But we sent out an email to our external stakeholders of our bus safety kit highlights. So that's letting you know what OSSE is doing to keep our students safe during this whole new world of COVID. So the internal measures that we have implemented to protect the students and well-being of our students, staff, and school communities that we serve. The document is listed on the OSSE website, and the document will cover the following topics: student and staff safety. The student and staff safety remind our top priority. We're focusing on the avoidance of infections while students and staff are in transit, and work with implementing specific bus cleaning and disinfecting processes. So that's letting you know what we're doing to keep out the students and drivers and attendants safe. Parent, school, and stakeholder communication and education. DOT is utilizing internal and external resources, ensuring all stakeholders are educated and informed on division, agency, local, and federal information as we navigate through this new normal. And division rebranding. DOT recently rebranded our buses to read District of Columbia Student Transportation. This rebranding is a small reflection of our changes we've made to better communicate to stakeholders, representation, and who we serve. So that's the information that's in the documentation we sent to the bus safety kit. And if you didn't receive that email, please just reach out to OSSE DOT and we'll make sure you get that information. Next slide, please. Our final slide is just letting everybody know if we do have any new coordinators, our training dates below. We'll be having training every other week for so if you don't have access, we will definitely need for you to register for training, because you won't have gain access to the system without this training. So the training dates are below. We have them through September, and the last date is November 23rd. So please register for those training dates, and you will be able to gain access once completion of that training. And there's also, if you want to contact the TOE support line for any questions, we can be reached Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And the number is 202-576-5520, or you can reach us at dot.data@dc.gov. So we're always responding to our emails. And just remember, you can just reach out to us on phone as well. And that's all for me. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat, and then we'll be on a little bit afterwards as well to answer any transportation questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Douglas. We're going to transition to our non-public monitoring team to share some updates that they have to share with our LEAs. We have Edgar Stewart on the line that will present this information.
Good morning. Thank you, Tiffany. Next slide, please. So we've received a number of questions that have come in regarding primarily learning plans, but also some transportation. So we're going to provide some of that information to you this morning. Also, and you'll see it later on in the slides, we'll be having a webinar on the 21st of September, just this coming Monday, to provide more in-depth information as it relates to not just learning plans, but also to reporting requirements for non-publics as it relates to COVID-19. Talking a little bit about safety measures as well. So stay tuned for that and for more detailed information. But for the purposes of this webinar this morning, I'm just going to go through a couple of the questions that we've received and give you some information. First one, is OSSE requiring a standardized distance learning plan, for example, same content sections or formatting, to better determine what services will be delivered and the quality of the instruction? The shorter answer is no. We don't have a kind of required or standardized distance learning plan template. The guidance that we have given to non-publics, and you have been copied on it, has been that really in ensuring FAPE and that students are receiving FAPE in non-public schools, there should be ongoing collaboration with the LEA such that any learning plans that are developed and document continuous learning plans align not only with the LEA's learning plans, but also with the District of Columbia's continuous learning and school recovery plan, and also the guiding principles for continuous education. I'm sure you all have seen those documents. We have resource links at the end of this presentation to them as well. But really, this is in some ways kind of business as usual in terms of the the crux of it is ongoing collaboration with your non-public schools who are serving your students to be able to develop those learning plans. The guiding principles for continuous education provide a really nice kind of foundational kind of element to looking at the elements that should be in plans. But again, OSSE is not requiring there to be a standard kind of learning plan. Finally, sorry, could you go back just a second? Thank you. Finally, learning plans should also be in compliance with the OSSE COA regulation. So, again, things like ensuring that students have the appropriate hours, that all of the elements of their IEPs are served. Next slide, please. The next question, how are LEAs to ensure that they receive all distance learning plans from all non-public schools that serve their students? So what OSSE on a number of occasions that's coincided with the publication of our 3 non-public specific guidance documents, we've communicated to non-publics that, number one, in order to get paid, but also to ensure that students are receiving, what they're entitled to under FAPE, that non-publics are sending copies of their learning plans to their OSSE assigned monitor and to each LEA whose students that they're serving. So you should have already received copies of plans for the 2021 school year from all of the non-publics whose students they're serving. And if you haven't, you should first be contacting the non-public schools to request a copy of that distance learning plan. Please, it's recommended to copy both myself and Sharon Powell on those emails, just so that we're aware of it, and hopefully you know who you're assigned. Well, copy either Sharon or myself on it, and we can route it to the assigned monitor for that non-public school. So reach out to the non-public first, and if you're not successful and they haven't been responsive, certainly reach out directly to us, and we can assist with nudging them. What you see here in this third bullet point is that there is additional guidance related to the requirements for learning plans for non-public schools. So this link will take you to that guidance document. Next slide, please. So this question, how can LEAs hold non-public schools accountable for providing makeup services, recovery services, and compensatory education? Firstly, what OSSE really wants to emphasize is that LEA should be incorporating into their recovery planning any resources that are needed, and the timeframes that IEPs will be expected to meet to make individualized comp ed decisions. LEAs are responsible for ensuring the delivery of services designed to mitigate student regression and address the recovery of loss of learning that may have occurred during the school closure or remote or blended learning due to COVID. And really, what's important here is that ultimately LEAs are responsible for ensuring FAPE and ensuring, that students are getting whatever recovery services they need, even for their students at non-public schools. So, as we continue to stress, what's important here is that ongoing collaboration, but LEAs again are reminded that ultimately they are responsible. OSEP has provided some guidance on, some additional guidance on this question, and we'll be covering it a little bit more depth in our upcoming webinar. So you're invited to attend that webinar as well. Finally, when it comes to specifically, looking at compensatory services, that are made and that are needed, IDEA doesn't really address, compensatory services in terms of, what equitable remedies are. That's really for each IEP team to determine and discuss, within the context of the IEP team for each individual student as is needed. So what we've included here is, more specific information as it relates to compensatory services. So in using this link here for the guidance related to remote and blended learning, you'll find much more comprehensive information with regard to comp ed services. But again, what's important is really distinguishing comp ed services from recovery services or makeup services. Next slide, please. I know Doug talked a little bit about transportation before. what we wanted to make sure that you all were aware of is, as non-public schools, transition from virtual instruction to providing either hybrid or in-person instruction, that you're working with the non-public school well ahead of time. I know DOT is asking for at least 20 days to make sure that they have enough time, for what's anticipated to be a significant number of requests coming in. But to be able to provide, and submit transportation request forms to ensure that students are able to be transported to non-public schools once they have shifted to some version of in-person transport. Whether it's DCPS or the charter schools, the OSSE DOT is prepared to transport any non-public student, to their non-public schools once they open for some kind of in-person learning. Next slide. Thank you. So as I said before, we have an upcoming webinar. It's in the LEA Look Forward, COVID-19 IDEA and the delivery of services in non-public schools. There's going to be two parts to this webinar on Monday. They're two different, distinctly different content sections. In the morning, we will be covering from 10:30 to 12 o'clock, really a focus on, like I said before, covering how to implement, the implementation of distance learning and hybrid education, really being able to look at the IEP and SPED compliance kind of requirements as it relates to delivery of FAPE. What we also have is an example of an LEA and a non-public collaborating on developing and implementing a distance learning plan. So that will be, I think, a really informative session. They're going to really help you all to think about what that successful collaboration can look like, and elements that you might consider in that collaboration. Excuse me. In the second session, from 1 o'clock to 2:30 on the same day, on Monday the 21st, we'll be covering kind of the more nuts and bolts issues as it relates to our OSSE's expectations for how non-publics are taking safety measures into account in this COVID period, what delivery of services in terms of telehealth looks like, answering any kind of questions related to non-public programming and payment and invoice submission, reviewing the attendance, the updated attendance policy along with the codes that are COVID-19 specific. And finally, our colleagues in transportation will also be kind of talking about the transportation process as it relates to transporting non-public students to those schools as they occur. So if you have any questions about it, the slide deck that you'll get today for this webinar includes the links to register for each one of those sessions on the 21st. But you can also reach out to me if you have more questions, and my contact information is here below. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edgar. I'm going to turn over to Victoria to share with us a little bit more about the Special Education Continuous Learning Community of Practice.
Thanks, Tiffany. This is Victoria Glick from K-12, and I want to just briefly let everyone on the call today know about an exciting opportunity that OSSE is rolling out in partnership with a third party. You'll receive a follow-up email about this, but there's some information here in the webinar for you to review in the posted handout materials, and a survey link that we are asking you to complete. We are embarking on a special education continuous learning community of practice. Next slide, please. We're working with the Ability Challenge to do this work, and it's an exciting opportunity to put together LEAs across the district, having different practical experience in rolling out programming in distance learning models. And so on the next slide, there's some information about what this community of practice will look like. Schools have to confront some really difficult questions this school year around distance learning and moving into hybrid models, hopefully at some point. And we are working to create a space where LEAs can seek answers and develop practical solutions. Next slide, Tiffany. There's some information here on what the community practice is and is not. I would ask you to take a look at that information. And then on the next slide, there's some additional information on who should participate and what the expectations are. We are calling on LEAs to think about whether or not your staff could participate in this community practice, and thinking through what exactly the time commitments would be, and the level of engagement around decision making and empowerment to fully participate in modeling these experiments inside your school buildings, to help the overall ed sector develop practices that work in a distance learning model. And so on the next slide, we ask you to fill out the linked survey here on the bottom left-hand side, to tell us what you think fresh information is on what this community practice should focus on. And we also ask that if you would like to be a participant, that you note that in the survey where there's an opportunity to do so. And our partners at the Ability Challenge, Matt and Sarah, whose email addresses are also below, will reach out to you to talk with you more about your LEA's participation. So please complete the survey. Look out for an email also in the coming week with the same information, but we ask you to take a look here. And I'll hand it off now to my partners to do some updates so that we can wrap up and respect everyone's time.
Thanks so much, Victoria. I'm going to pass the mic quickly to Jen to share with us some reminders and announcements from our wonderful teaching and learning team.
Hi, everyone. This is Jen Carpenter. Just wanted to remind everyone that OSSE has launched a special education resource hub to assist families and students with things they need to know about special education this year in particular. There are 7 categories of information, and it's very user-friendly, and I hope that you will pass this resource on to the families you serve. Next slide. I also wanted to note that to complement the guidance that has been consolidated that Victoria described earlier around remote and blended learning, there is an LEA toolkit to support that work that features a data tool and many survey tools that feed into that data tool and allow you to keep track of things like student engagement, parent engagement, service provision, and how your students are doing, both academically and social emotionally during this time. We hope that you'll visit the landing page and access on the landing page all of the resources and videos that show you how to use them. And finally, please, if you haven't already, register to receive the TAL PD Bulletin, where you'll get information about PD opportunities every month. And just a heads up to those of you who are interested, on October 13th, 2 online classes will launch relevant to special education. The IEP Quality Series will now be an online class that runs October through December, and the High Leverage Practices for Students with Disabilities series will be running from October through November. That class is asynchronous. The IEP Quality Series has some webinar meetings with flexible times available to meet people's changing schedules. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much, Jen. I do want to highlight for folks that if you missed last month's webinar, we encourage you to reach out and visit our website here to download the training resource and materials that were shared, as well as listen to a recording of the presentation. We'd like to thank everyone for participating in this month's webinar. And of course, here is some points of contact here from our teams here at OSSE that support students with disabilities and the work that goes around there for you all. We want to highlight that our next webinar will be October 21st at 10 a.m. And here's a link to register. When you do register, you will be registered for all the series for the remainder of the school year. OSSE staff, we have a little bit of time to address
questions. If we see any questions that will be for the greater good here in the question box that we should share while we're here on the call, feel free to hop on and share those. And if anyone had any questions to put in the chat box, we are here to support in answering your questions. And I think it may be a few questions in the chat box about data support. Rita, I'm not sure if you can answer any of the questions that were here that may be good to share for the group at large.
Yes, I did have a question about homeschooling, and I did enter in. So the question was if you need to have a student removed because they're doing homeschooling, what is necessary to have that student withdrawn in SEDS. So what I did, I entered some information about the necessary exit codes, and you can find this information in the entry exit guidance, that it also requires the homeschool form to be submitted to OSSE's homeschooling office. And then that information can be used to exit your student in the system. Was there another data related question that you wanted to have answered? Let's see. Okay, yes, I do have another one. A new SPED POC and a small LEA and have numerous students with overdue eligibilities and IEPs. They wanted to know a best strategy for child count, how to figure out how many students or how to correct these errors before child count. I would suggest that you use the UDE application, the Unified Data Errors application, to identify those students. And then you'll need to schedule necessary meetings in order to update IEPs and eligibilities prior to the November deadline.
Great, thank you so much, Rita.
Thank you.
Victoria and Christy, are there any questions that you felt may have been asked during the session that would be good to share with the greater group here while we're on the call?
Thanks, Tiffany.
Hey, this is Christy Weaver Harris. Oh, sorry, Victoria. I just want to flag that we're aware that LEAs are seeing a pretty high rate of overdue eligibilities because of COVID. This is something that we are working on internally to make sure that students are appropriately counted for the purposes of child count. So just make sure that, as Rita said, you are referring to the UDE data errors application, and make sure that you're updating things as best as possible. But we will be working on that internally to make sure that students are appropriately counted.
Thanks, Christy. And this is Victoria. I just wanted to add quickly, I see some questions, or at least one question about working with non-public schools to ensure that they're providing the technology or services that they've committed to in their remote learning plans. And so I think Edgar Stewart is the right point of contact for you to reach out to help facilitate that work. Dr. Stewart's email address is edgar.stewart, stewart@dc.gov.
Great, thank you so much, Victoria. It looks like at this time we don't have any other questions from the group. Again, this presentation has been recorded, and it includes resources with email addresses to reach out to the team here at OSSE in several different divisions if you have any remaining questions. We thank everyone for joining us this month, and we look forward to seeing you in October.